My name is Jeff Hunter from VMware. Been there about 8 years. I started out on the sales side of the house, and then I got smart, and I moved into the business unit. I'm just kidding. For all the sales guys out there, no offense. I'm just teasing. But anyway, I work in the technical marketing area for VMware, and you're probably wondering how does that work, right? So you've got marketing in your title, and you've got technical, and those two typically don't go together. Well, in this case, we make it work. We're the guys that write a lot of the white papers that are out there, the blog articles, presentations that you see from partners and VMware folks. Some of those come out of tech marketing too. So that is mainly what we focus on. Obviously, we're on the availability side since we're going to talk about Site Recovery Manager today. And now I'm going to turn it over to GS and give him a moment to introduce himself as well.
Yeah, my name is GS Kalsa. I'm also in technical marketing with Jeff. Focus on the same things he does, availability, so SRM, VR, VDP. I've been with VMware about 2 years. Been working with virtualization software since about 2005, and I've spent time as both a customer, with a partner, and now with VMware. So that out of the way, let's get into it. Just make sure you memorize that. Just read it really quick. Okay, so we're going to really quick go through what SRM is. Really quick again, go through what's new in SRM 6.1, and then we'll get into the meat of things, which is we've got a demo and some technical walkthrough of a whole bunch of different things. A few things to be clear about we're not covering. We're not going to do a deep dive on the new features of SRM. There's other sessions, and we'll point you to those that will get into all of that detail. We're not going to do, install and configure best practices. So we may throw in a few here or there, but that's not really what the focus of this is. So what is SRM? If you're here, more than likely you already know this, but just to make sure, SRM is an automation and orchestration solution for disaster recovery. It's not a replication solution. It's a tool to use to automate your runbook, make that easy to execute the same way every time, and give you the ability to non-disruptively test that as much as you need to. Architecture that you're all really familiar with, web client, vCenter, SSO, PSCs, all of that. So what's new with SRM 6.1? This is going to be really quick, and again, the sessions if you want deep dive detail on these new features, go to these sessions. So first, storage policy-based protection groups. Storage policy-based protection groups are a new type of protection group that is based on storage policies. So you create a storage policy, you associate data stores with that storage policy, then when you create a VM and you associate it with that policy, you place it on replicated storage, it's already protected by SRM. And it's not just for new VMs. If you have an existing VM, you storage vMotion it, you associate it with that policy, and again, it's automatically protected. And then the same thing from a deprovisioning standpoint. If you want to remove a VM from protection, disassociate it from that policy, it's unprotected automatically. Metro storage support. So for a long time, it's been a choice between either stretch storage or SRM. You always had to make that decision. With SRM 6.1, we now have combined those two. So you can use SRM on top of stretch storage. That's going to give you the ability to do a planned migration of VMs, move them from one site to the other non-disruptively in a disaster avoidance scenario. So really cool feature. There's a whole session just about that. Lastly, NSX integration. So where this comes from is there's a new version of NSX 6.2, that now supports the idea of multiple vCenters. So previously, NSX was a single vCenter concept. Now it supports primary NSX managers and secondary NSX managers. Specifically from the SRM integration standpoint, what we're talking about is if you protect a VM that's connected to this new concept that NSX 6.2 creates, which is called a universal logical switch, which is connecting two VMs, connecting a VM that's in one data center with a logical switch that's connected to the other vCenter. So two vCenters, same logical switch, same port group, same layer 2 domain. You connect a VM to that port group at one site, you protect it by SRM. SRM is going to see that it's connected to that universal logical switch and not require a mapping to map it at the other site. So you protect it at that one site, you don't need to do any mapping. If you recover it at the other site, it'll automatically connect it to that other network. So you've got that spanned layer 2. The one other thing that I will say with NSX 6.2 is it greatly enhances a feature like stretch storage, because with stretch storage, you need that ability to have that stretched layer 2 across those sites in order to be able to utilize stretch storage, because you need that IP address isn't going to be able to be changed as part of that move. So that's those 3 features in a nutshell. The last thing that's new around SRM, this isn't an SRM thing, is we now support a 5-minute RPO with vSphere replication. However, for this version, that is only from a vSAN to a vSAN. So from vSAN to vSAN, you now have 5-minute RPO. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, and he's going to run through a recovery plan.
Yeah, so again, as GS mentioned, we're not going to get into the new features. That was a quick intro. There are dedicated sessions for the new features and functionality. They're in Site Recovery Manager. What we're going to focus on here is just literally walking you through some of the features that SRM has had for quite some time. Some of it's newer, some of it's been around a while. I'm going to start out right out of the gate with something that really should apply to everyone here, and that's running a recovery plan. That's the whole reason SRM exists. So if you've not seen SRM in action, that's what we're about to show you, is exactly how that works. As a matter of fact, my demo environment is literally a bunch of screenshots on slides, but it's going to look and feel like a live demo. And what's good about that is you don't have to sit there and watch the little wheels spin while the recovery plan is happening, because it takes maybe 5 or 10 minutes to get through a recovery plan to recover those VMs. So that's the reason I went down that route. Everybody's always like, oh, show us a live demo. That's fine if you guys want to sit there for about 10 minutes and just watch it step through the recovery steps. It's about as exciting as watching Jell-O harden up. So we're not going to go down that path. I'm going to move you through the boring stuff quickly by utilizing this method here. So here's what we're looking at. As I mentioned, I've got 2 sites. I have 4 virtual machines that support my accounting applications. They are in Palo Alto, and I think these are old slides, by the way, but that's okay, because I changed some stuff in the Speaker Resource Center, and they didn't update it, but that's all right. You're not going to miss out on anything. That's the good part. So we have a disaster situation. It's more of a disaster avoidance. So there is a pipe that has burst above the data center, and it's probably going to leak down onto the rack that contains the virtual machines that make up my accounting VMs. So what I need to do is evacuate those virtual machines before that water actually starts coming down. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to do what's called a planned migration. Now, there's a difference between a planned migration and disaster recovery, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But what I'm going to show you here is the SRM user interface. Now, this is what a recovery plan looks like after you initially configure it. You've got a few little icons up there, kind of in the upper left-hand corner, like you'll see a little green arrow and a red button there. The green arrow is your test button. The red button is recovery. So I would click that, and here's what I see. I see a confirmation message. Hey, we are about to do a recovery. Are you sure you want to do that? And by the way, you can pick here between a planned migration and a disaster recovery. Now, what's the difference between those two? Very little difference. With a planned migration, the main thing SRM does is it verifies that replication and everything works as it should, and then it continues with the recovery of those virtual machines. Because think about it. If you're doing a planned migration and something goes wrong, you don't want it to continue to fail those VMs over. You want to fix that issue and then try again. Disaster recovery, on the other hand, is, hey, we need to get those virtual machines up and running no matter what. So even if something goes wrong when we're trying to do that final sync, SRM does a final sync before it actually fails over virtual machines from one side to the other. That's going to minimize data loss for you. But in a disaster recovery situation where we've lost our primary site, we're not going to be able to sync, right, if that site is completely down. So with disaster recovery, it's going to fail over regardless of whether we're able to complete that final sync or not. So that's the difference between those two and when you would use one or the other. Hopefully that makes perfect sense. So anyway, back to our user interface here. There's also a checkbox that says, I understand that the process will permanently alter virtual machines and so on and so forth. This is just kind of a check and balance. Hey, you hit this button. You know you hit this button, right? So click this checkbox to verify you know you hit this button, which is a good thing once again. So we check the box, we hit next, and at this point, okay, we're ready to go. This is what's going to happen. We hit finish. The recovery plan will start going through its process at that point then. So you'll see these bars, and this is the part I was telling you about. If we were doing a live demo, I could walk off the stage and go get me a beer and then come back and you guys could see it finish. But fortunately, we're doing screenshots here. So the recovery plan is going to run very quickly. Look how fast SRM is. It's amazing. Man. No, in reality, that was about a 5-minute time lapse right there. So it took about 5 or 6 minutes to fail over 4 virtual machines about an 800-mile distance. Now, obviously, we had done replication with vSphere replication ahead of that, but as far as the actual recovery time for those 4 VMs, in all honesty, hopefully, I don't know about the folks in the back, but hopefully you can see the start times and finish times down here, and again, about 5 minutes elapsed to get those virtual machines failed over. Okay? Now, we can see further proof, too, and again, I was grabbing these screenshots in real time here. I looked at the recovery site, so you can see pod 02, that's my Palo Alto data center where I failed over to. We could see that those 4 accounting virtual machines were powered on. You can kind of see the screenshot there of the Linux operating system booting up, so we know that our VMs are actually up and running over there. Another nice thing with Site Recovery Manager is you'll get a history report. This is great for auditing and compliance. So if somebody comes to the table and says, hey, when's the last time you tested your disaster recovery plan? You can pull this history report up here. You can give them an exact date and time. If there were errors, those will show up there as well. You can see the elapsed time there toward the bottom. Hopefully you can anyway. Once again, my apologies to the folks in the back. 5 minutes and 12 seconds is the exact number that it took to fail those over. And then if you scroll down further, we'd be able to see details about individual steps. So at this point, what we've done is we've failed over from one to the other site. Now, I realize those are backwards. Like I said, this is an old slide deck. They didn't update them like I wanted them to, but that's all right. Basically, what's happened is we've gone from one site to the other, but we're not done yet. Now those VMs are kind of stuck there, if you will. There's no way to fail those back yet. So what we have to do is we have to go through what's called a reprotect workflow. And basically what reprotect does in Site Recovery Manager is it is going to reverse replication. Actually, it's going to clean up the protected site, the original site first. It's going to reverse replication after that. And then it's going to reset that recovery plan, so that way we can indeed test and fail back over, so we can do that plan migration back after we get that water pipe fixed. So, what does that look like? We'll walk through the process here. In this case, hopefully you can see it. It's kind of small in the UI, but there's a little shield up there, and that's our reprotect. That's what we click on to get started. So we click on that. Again, we have a checkbox to verify, is this exactly what you want to do? I understand I'm going to make a permanent change here. I'm going to reverse replication, all the good stuff I just told you about. So I click that checkbox, I hit next, there's my summary screen, and then I hit finish. And once again, thank goodness this isn't a live demo, because this is going to take a little while. And the reason it's going to take a little while is specifically because of vSphere replication. We're here to be completely transparent, and one thing I'm going to point out is that it has to do a full sync back to that site. So it's not just the incremental differences, it's actually going to compare the source and the target completely, and then replicate those changes. So don't be surprised if you have vSphere replication in your environment, you do a reprotect. It only took 5 minutes to do the failover, but it might take 20 or 30 minutes to do the reprotect because it has to reverse replication, get everything synced up again. So just something to be aware of. Anyway, it goes through the plan. At this point here, we can see success across the board. Green is always good. Lots of green check marks, so that looks nice. Happy to see that. And then here's that vSphere replication thing I was telling you about. So there's the proof right there. A couple of the VMs are done, but there's still a couple going through that initial full sync. So again, that reprotect is going to take time. If you go to do this and you're thinking, man, this is taking a while, something's broken, that's not the case at all. Look into the vSphere replication UI and look for those types of things right there, and you'll probably see that it's doing some initial sync still. Now, once that initial sync is done, we are then back to where we were before, having a protected set of virtual machines, only this time we're at the recovery site. Okay? Now, I'm going to keep the round trip just so you can keep track of the VMs and where they're at. You'll notice it's yellow. You're thinking, well, you just did a reprotect. It's going to work, right? What should I do before I migrate back? You should test. Test that migration before you actually do it again. There's a test button in SRM. Use it. Use it all the time. Not only when you fail over, but when you go to fail back. So I'll show you what that looks like. Real quickly here, I'm not going to walk through the part where you hit next and the checkbox and all that kind of stuff, right? This is exactly what a test is going to look like. It's going to look very similar to a recovery, and it's going to give you all that same type of information, and it should happen fairly quick, about the same amount of time that an actual failover takes. Once we've tested, now I'm comfortable in saying that we're green. We're halfway around now, so we're doing a round trip between these data centers. I've tested, and it worked, so I'm confident now that when I migrate back, I'm good to go. So that's exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to do a migration back. Again, I'm going to go a little bit quicker this time because we've seen this. So I check the box, I hit next, I hit finish. We see the plan is starting through, and now recovery is complete. So very similar times here, about 5.5 minutes to fail back. So at this time, we are back in Palo Alto. So our VMs are now running back at the original site. We cleaned up the pipe mess, everything's good, the servers are online, so we were able to fail back. Go through the reprotect workflow. Got to do that again because we can't fail back over until we reprotect and reverse replication. And now that we've reprotected, we're in a good spot here. So this is basically back to square one. We've actually taken those virtual machines round trip to the recovery site. We reprotected. We tested to make sure that we could migrate back without any issues. We went ahead and did the migration. Now there's one last thing that we need to do, and that's reprotect one more time. So I'll skip through that. There's the test piece. I've reprotected. I want to test again. And we've gone full circle there. So again, after you do a reprotect, run that test workflow just to make sure everything is truly reprotected. Any questions on that process there? We literally sent 4 VMs round trip, 800 miles. Yes, sir?
When you have full sync, will it take any of the old data that you have, existing in the old in the Palo Alto?
So yeah, so let's dig into that just for a second. I want to make sure we stay on time here. But the way vSphere replication works when it does a full sync is it will actually take the source VMDK file, it will compare it to the target VMDK file, it will use checksums to verify which data is in sync and which data is not. After it does that complete check all the way through, then it will actually replicate the changes. Now the process of going through and creating those checksums and comparing all those, that can take a considerable amount of time too. So it's not just replicating the changes, but also the comparison. So to answer your question, yes, vSphere replication will use existing data, if it's available, back in the original data center, but there's still some time there as we do that check between the two and then sync the changes over. Good? Good. So I'm sorry, the question was what would happen if we just do the source VM? I still don't understand, I'm sorry. Ask again. If you delete the source VM, it depends. So if you stop replication in vSphere replication, it's going to delete the target. If you just delete the source VM out from underneath the vSphere replication, it's still going to have a copy of that replica at the other site. So think about disaster recovery, right? So this is the whole reason vSphere replication and SRM are in place. If we would lose that initial site, that's kind of the same thing. I basically deleted that source VM. I still have that replica. Now, that replica could be 20 minutes old, it could be 2 hours old, just depends on what my RPO was and when the last time I replicated that data. But to answer your question, yes, even if the source goes away, I can still do a disaster recovery with vSphere replication and SRM. Does that answer the question? Oh, you're great segue, because I'm going to get into the whole IP address management and all that kind of stuff, but a quick answer to your question, we can change IP addresses when we fail over and fail back. I'm going to show a little bit more of that, though. But before I get into that, one of the things you want to do, and we'll take more questions at the end, by the way. I'm guessing there's more questions out there. I don't want to get too far off track time-wise, though. I want to make sure we get through the demos. GS has a really cool demo, too, around some automation stuff. We don't want to miss out on that. So speaking of IP address management and so forth, something you'll do when you implement SRM initially is you will map resources, networks, folders, and so forth between the sites. So I'm going to show you what that looks like here a little bit. And there's a key benefit here. If you think about doing this ahead of time, that means that's something we're not going to have to do when we do an actual disaster recovery. That's the whole reason we map these ahead of time. So that way when you hit the failover button, you know that your VMs are going to land in the folder that you want them to, because again, you map this ahead of time. They're going to be in the correct resource pool. They're going to be connected to the right port group. They might even have the storage policy associated with it that you need, a newer feature in SRM. So we want to make sure we map that stuff ahead of time, so that way we don't have to worry about it. When we're actually doing that disaster recovery, we can hit the red button and just let the magic run. So here's what the mappings look like. First, you see this screen here. As you can see, it's empty, so we're going to need to add some mappings. So we'll start to do that. Now, something Site Recovery Manager does, and I think this is pretty unique, I'm not aware of any other product that'll do this, it can automatically prepare mappings between sites based on the names of my port groups. So if I am good at naming standards, and I have named my recovery site just like my protected site, then SRM can go, oh, I see these two port groups match. You know what? I'll take care of that. I'll map those for you, no problem. Maybe I have a dozen or 5 dozen of those types of things. If you only have a couple, no big deal. You can do it manually. You see the bottom button there, prepare mappings manually. You can do it manually if you want. But if you have lots of port groups, lots of VLANs and so forth, and you want to just do it automatic, SRM can take care of that for you.
And just one thing to throw out there about that automatic mapping is, just to be clear, that's automatically mapping it when you're configuring these mappings. If you change or add port groups, it's not going to automatically map those unless you go into this screen and select that again. So just to be clear, it's going to map them, but it's not going to automatically do this after you do it that first time, if you change it. So
yeah, so in other words, if you make changes to the network, and that never happens, but if it does happen to happen in your environment, you'll need to go back in and make sure you map those, okay? So here's what it looks like in the UI. You can see again my source and my target site, or my protected site and my recovery site, as they refer to it in the documentation there. I'm going to select my protected site, Wenatchee in this case, and then I'm going to select Palo Alto, and then you can see the Add Mappings button lights up there. So I click that button, and it says, oh, I've got 3 mappings. My environment's fairly small. It's a lab environment, so I don't have a ton of port groups and VLANs and all that stuff going on, but I do have 3 in there. You can kind of see them toward the bottom. They're a little grayed out until I click the OK button, but now you can hopefully see them better. And as I said, I have them named the same on both sides, so SRM detected that, boom, automatically mapped those 2 together, so that was very easy. I didn't have to go through the manual process of doing that. Okay? Here's another thing, test networks. Now, it does not automatically set up your test networks for you. SRM is very smart, but it doesn't necessarily know what network that you want to use for testing, so you're going to have to go in and you're going to have to configure that piece of it. So that's what I do, is I click on isolated network. And by the way, what that means is when SRM fails over virtual machines to that isolated network, we're talking about creating a virtual switch over there, like on the fly, but it's not going to have any outbound connectivity. So if you need to do basic testing, I just want to make sure that the virtual machine powers on and the guest OS comes up, great. You can leave it like that if you want to. You can keep it very simple. Most folks want to do a little more disaster recovery testing, so they need communication between hosts and virtual machines and so forth. So many folks with SRM will create an isolated VLAN over there at their test site, and then they will use that. And that's exactly what I just configured here, is I switch it over to my test port group, which is that isolated VLAN. Now, I'm not going to walk through the process of doing that for each one. So poof, we've got some nice magic here, and there it is. All of them are already configured. Again, the beauty of not doing a live demo. Watching me click and click and click again.
one thing I would just point out and recommend from a test network scenario is you have that default SRM option, which isn't ideal, but is handy if you need it. The thing I'd recommend is work with your network team to create a copy of your production network, so that you have, if you've got 5 VLANs in your production network and there's firewall rules or routing between those, create a duplicate of those and use that as your test network, and have the uplink disconnected so it's isolated. But that way you'll get a true test of what SRM is going to do when you run that test of your recovery plan.
Yep, there's a few ways to do that, so that's something you just have to work out with the network team there a little bit. All right, so now we've mapped from one site to the other, and the question is, well, what about coming back? Because I just showed earlier that we did a failover, reprotect, and then a fail back, and then a reprotect. So what about when I come backward? Well, again, SRM is pretty sharp here. This is something that's pretty unique to SRM as far as I know. Nobody else has this. So not only can we automate the process of mapping across from one data center to the other, but we can automate the reverse mappings as well. So you'll see there, prepare reverse mappings toward the top of the window. I would select all applicable ones. So I check all of those, and then I hit next. And now in this case, I have both mappings in both directions, or all 3 mappings in both directions. So now I can fail over and fail back, and I know that my virtual machines are going to be connected to the correct when they are failed over in either direction. So again, a very beautiful thing. You set all this up ahead of time. You don't have to worry about it when disaster actually strikes there. Okay? Now, something else I'll point out here too, though, is, let me go one more slide, is those test network. I don't know if any of you saw it or not, but I actually switched data centers. So I'm now at my disaster recovery site. Again, SRM is pretty smart, but it does not know exactly what test network I want to do. So I need to switch over to that Palo Alto data center there, and what I need to do then is configure test networks over there as well. So that's exactly what I did right there. Again, you can go here, you can edit, you can expand that, you can see your port groups over at the site over there. I named mine pretty straightforward, so I select test, I hit OK. I actually do that for all 3 of those, so that way I know that I'm using my test network whenever I hit the test button. And that's a key feature of Site Recovery Manager. It knows whether you hit the run button or the test button, and it connects it to the appropriate network. Again, that's not something we want to mess with manually, especially when we're doing a test or a failover. I think what would be even worse than connecting an actual recovery to your test network would be connecting a test to your production network. So we don't want to make that mistake, and SRM is going to help you avoid that. Because what happens if you connect to a production network and production's up at your source site too, you can have VMs with the same names, potentially IP addresses, and lots of other stuff in common. And that's going to be a headache. So let's not deal with that. Let's make sure we configure our test networks. That way when I hit the test button, I connect to the test network automatically. I don't have to think about it.
Oh, one other quick thing to point out is I didn't talk about it earlier when I was talking about what's new with SRM 6.1, but the thing that Jeff just walked through about configuring test networks at the site level is actually new to 6.1. If you're familiar with working with SRM, previously you'd have to configure that at the recovery plan level. You'd map your test network. So this ability to map it at the site level just makes it one step easier. If you've got a bunch of different recovery plans, you just can configure your test network once and you're done. You don't have to configure it more than once at the recovery plan level. So.
Yep, very good. Now, the last thing I'm going to walk you through here before I turn it over to GS, and this ties back to a question that was asked earlier, is what about IP customization? It would be great if we had stretched VLANs between sites across the board. However, I know probably 70 to 80% of us do not have that luxury of having stretched networks across sites, so we have to change IP addresses in most cases. Now, again, something fairly unique to SRM, as a matter of fact, I don't know of anybody else that does this just the same, is the ability to map subnets. What I don't want to get in the habit of doing is having to go into each VM and specify, okay, when I fail this over, change it to this IP address. VM number 2, got to do it again. VM number 3, and walk through that process over and over and over. Again, no problem if you have 20 VMs. If you have 200, that gets to be pretty cumbersome. So let's instead map subnets. The VM is in this subnet at the protected site. When it fails over, it gets this subnet at the recovery site. Straightforward. The only thing that doesn't change would be that last octet, for example, in a Class C subnet. Okay, it's going to maintain that last one. And I'll show you that actually here with some more screenshots. So again, here's our environment. We are going to click on our static port group. So no DHCP here. I'm going to need to change some IP addresses. And I'm going to go ahead and configure this subnet mapping. Okay, so rule name, oh, good. Great, awesome. Again, good thing we're not doing a live demo, otherwise you would have had to watch me type all that. Okay? So what I did here is I mapped my class, I've got a class C here, so 10.144.106, I think I zoom in. Yep, that's better. Hopefully you can see it better now. 106, and I mapped that to 10.20.181.0 at my recovery site. So now what's going to happen is a virtual machine that I fail over is going to just keep that last octet. It's going to change the first 3 octets, but keep the last one. So if the VM is 10.144.106.99 at the source site, by virtue of mapping these subnets when SRM fails it over, it'll be 10.20.181.99. Those are going to match up, so that makes it a whole lot easier. I can configure gateway, DNS. There's a lot of cool stuff we can do with this. So there it is configured.
One thing people ask a lot about too with IP customization is how do I get DNS to update? And there's a couple of different answers for that. So one is if your environment is mostly or all Microsoft, if you utilize dynamic DNS, that will just get updated automatically. When that VM boots back up, it's going to talk to Active Directory, communicate with your DNS server, and update its DNS. If you want a more automated solution, there's actually a couple of scripts that are included in your SRM install that are related to updating DNS. And there's one in there for bind and one in there for Microsoft. So you can utilize those to basically trigger a DNS update. So a couple different ways that you can deal with that. If you're using a third-party solution like Infoblox or something like that, you can look at, I think we just finished some work with Infoblox around kind of a VCO workflow related to updating DNS using Infoblox, so that's a possible solution there. But usually there's different ways that you can handle that problem. So,
yep. One other thing I'll throw out there too, and the network guys are going to cringe on this one a little bit, but think about DHCP for your servers. What, in the data center? Are you crazy? Who would do that? Who would do that? Well, as a matter of fact, I talked to a pretty large customer that has done that for several hundred virtual machines, and it actually worked out pretty well because they did reservations for all those VMs at the target location. So the VMs, when they were failed over, they got the same IP address every time, and they knew which IP address that was going to be because of those reservations, but then it also turned around and updated DNS and so forth accordingly. So that's one thing to consider too. Food for thought, like I said. Now, with the mapping, you'll notice that I've got the static mapping here. I still don't have a customization rule, though, at the other site, too, so that is something that I need to take care of. Well, can I reverse mappings? Yes, I can. Is it possible to override mappings? Again, I'm not going to walk you through that. You've seen what it looks like when you do a reverse mapping, right? You go through and you click the check boxes and hit yes, and it just sets it up for you. So that's a beautiful thing. But the question I more commonly get is it possible to override? So I've set this up environment-wide, these mappings that I've just done for resource pools and folders and so forth, networks. But maybe there's a couple VMs that I don't necessarily, I want to override that and connect to a different network other than what I configured in those mappings. So the answer is, quite honestly, yes, you can do that. You can go into the protection properties of that virtual machine, and you can specify a different network that will override those mappings that we just created there. Okay? I'll quickly move through this. Again, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A. It's very similar to what you just saw from the network side. Again, for folders, a lot of folks use folders to organize their VMs. They might have a marketing folder, an accounting folder, and this business unit drives me crazy folder, but we need to protect their VMs anyway. So we have all those folders set up. We want to be able to map those when we fail over so we can still maintain that organization there. Again, we can automatically do that. Very simple, right? There's what it looks like, very similar to the networks. We select it, we hit add mappings, we hit OK, and we can see that our mappings are down here. Now, you see the data centers there, right? Hopefully most of you know this, but vCenter sees those data center objects as folders. A little bit of VMware trivia in case you didn't know that. So that's why it shows up down there. Not only do I have my regular VM folders, but you can see the mapping of my data centers as well at the folder level. Of course, I can reverse that mapping too. Why wouldn't I be able to do that, right? I can do it with networks. Of course we can do it with folders. And there is the mapping when it's complete then, with reverse. Okay? Now, resource mappings. Again, I'll walk through this very quickly. This is another thing you'll have to do, and I'm going to do this one real quick because, again, it's very similar. I select them, add mappings. You can see the mappings down there at the bottom. Same thing, only this time clusters. I don't know if everybody knows this or not. Hopefully you do. But a cluster is a resource pool. It's the root resource pool in a VMware environment. So again, that's why we see those there. We see those clusters mapped together, plus the resource pools that I explicitly created, high and low. I know there's probably different names I could have used, but that was easy. We can reverse those mappings, as you would expect, so that's done. And then there are my mappings at the resource pool level. So far, we've done network mappings, we've done folder mappings, we've done resource pool mappings. We've set this all up ahead of time. Again, this is very cool with SRM. We don't have to worry about this when we fail over. Something new, storage policy mappings. Okay, so if you're using storage policies with vVols or vSAN, you can map those just the same, because when I have a virtual machine at my source location that is protected by, say, let's say virtual SAN Platinum, lots of stripes and 2 failures to tolerate and all kinds of cool stuff that really makes that VM perform and stay well protected. When I fail that over to my target site, I want to make sure it has that same policy, because I need to make sure that VM performs the same when I fail it over. We might have to run in that DR site for a while. I want to make sure it has the same number of failures to tolerate and so on and so forth, depending on that storage policy. So again, with SRM, just like you've seen before, automatic, we can do it. It's easy.
One other thing to just quickly throw in there about the storage policies is, I talked briefly when we started about SRM 6.1 and the storage policy-based protection groups. That's where that mapping is really critical. If you're going to use storage policy-based protection groups, make sure that you map your storage policy in that mapping place.
Yep. And there it is, real quick screenshot on that. You can see virtual SAN down there at the bottom, vVols. So pretty straightforward stuff, but that's a nice new feature in 6.1. We can not only map all that other stuff I just talked about, but storage policies as well. Of course I can reverse it. Why wouldn't I be able to? So that's there too. And there we have the mappings with the reversed mapping as well. So that's the basics of setting up all your mappings ahead of time with SRM. Honestly, that took me maybe, I know I ran through that quick. In real time, that probably took me maybe a half an hour to set up. Again, because I use good naming standards. I had a solid understanding of SRM. I read the docs and the release notes ahead of time, all that good stuff, right? So I'm going to turn it over to GS now. He's got one final demo for you. And like I said, we'll keep time for Q&A right after this, I think. Right, GS?
Yep.
Sweet.
Yeah, so I actually originally had 2 demos for you. And in the spirit of, part of why Jeff went with the slide thing, The second one of my demos was actually going to be a live demo in my environment down in Palo Alto, and I've tried all day long to get connectivity to work consistently from here to Palo Alto, and that didn't happen, so no. His slides are definitely more highly available than my live demo.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, no DR plan for my live demo. So the demo that I do have, though, is one of the capabilities that we introduced in SRM 5.8 was integration with vCenter Orchestrator, or what's now called vRealize Orchestrator. So we've added a couple of different plugins for vRealize Orchestrator, and those two that I'm going to highlight right now are the Site Recovery Manager plugin, as well as the vSphere Replication plugin. And the thing that, just out of curiosity, show of hands, how many people here have done anything with vRealize Orchestrator or vCenter Orchestrator? And that's usually what I find. That's maybe 10% of the audience, 15%. So vRealize Orchestrator is something that's included with your licensing for vCenter. So it's something that you have the capability to utilize right now. And what it is it's a tool that allows you to create custom workflows to do all kinds of different things in your environment. And I'm going to walk through an example here that's related to protection, but just a simple one that, just to give you an idea of some of the basic things that you could do with vRealize Orchestrator is, let's say right now in your environment, you give the ability, you let users spin up VMs. And that either means that you give them access to vCenter and credentials and things like that for them to spin up a VM, which creates all kinds of potential issues around what kind of a VM they're going to create, because it can be difficult to narrow things down in vCenter to letting them create just a specific type of VM. Or you have to create it for them. They send you an email and they say, hey, I want a VM with these capabilities or whatever, and you have to spin that up for them and then hand it over. So vRealize Orchestrator could let you create a workflow for creating a VM, and you could give them a narrow set of choices, a Linux VM, a Windows VM, maybe just 2 choices. You get 2 hard drive choices. You get, you only get 1 NIC. You get a certain amount of memory. Whatever you can create those parameters, give them that workflow, and then that's the only thing that they can do in vCenter, is they can spin up a VM. So Orchestrator has a lot of capabilities in that regard, and the thing that I want to walk through right now is I've created a workflow in vCenter Orchestrator, and I'm just going to exit out of this, and I'm actually just going to try and run this. I'm going to run our video, if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. So this workflow, what we're going to do is we've got an application, and we'll go over to the VM and templates and take a look here, and we've got 3 VMs here in this application. So 3 different VMs that are part of our customer service application. And what we're going to want to do is I'll show you that they're currently not being replicated. You look in vSphere replication, there's no replication going on. And we're going to navigate over to SRM, and I'm going to show you that there's no current protection group for them. We've got an accounting and a finance protection group. So no replication in place, no protection group, no recovery plan in place. So we're going to select all 3 of those, and then I'm going to kick off a VCO workflow. And I'll show you what doing that looks like. When you create VCO workflows, you can have them show up automatically in your default menus. So right there, I've got a workflow that I created called Replicate, Protect, and Protect VMs. So I'll kick off that workflow. It's going to come up with a dialog box here. And you can see my 3 VMs show up. I'm going to have some choices here in terms of where I want to store those VMs. And then I can select different RPOs for what I want. And you'll notice if you're familiar at all with configuring vSphere replication, you're seeing a subset of what you get to configure in vSphere replication here. And that's all flexible and controllable through VCO. So you can choose what you want to display to your user. You can give them a choice of options. You know, right here we're giving them 3 RPOs. If you pull up the console in vSphere replication, they can choose anything from 15 minutes to 24 hours and anything in between. So if you want to narrow the choices that you expose to your users, VCO is a nice place to do that. So we're going to leave it on our silver one. We're not going to enable compression. We're going to give that protection group a name. Just call it our customer service application. We'll run it now. You can see that that workflow started. And next we'll go over to navigate and just see how long it takes to run. I blank it out to make it seem like a long time has passed, but if you actually check it out, that was only about 20 seconds that it took for that workflow to run. So now we'll navigate over and take a look at vSphere replication. And in vSphere replication, you can see that we're currently just kicked off replication for those 3 customer service apps. They're doing their initial full sync. We'll go over to SRM again. In SRM, we now have our customer service applications protection group. Take a look at the recovery plan. It's already been added to the entire site recovery plan. Look at our virtual machines. Our 3 virtual machines are protected. So all of that was triggered with a VCO workflow. That's something that you could expose to your users. It's something that you could use for configuring protection of VMs. Just makes that whole process a whole lot easier. So the other demo that I was going to show you, and I apologize that that didn't work out, but I can give you just in a quick nutshell what that was going to do, just to give you an idea of some of the scripting capabilities with SRM. What I was going to demonstrate was sometimes customers ask about, well, I've got my protection site, and my protection site has all the resources that I need, but due to budget constraints, my recovery site is a little bit smaller than my protected site. And so when I fail my VMs over to my recovery site, I need them to utilize less resources, or some of them to utilize less resources. And so the thing that I did was I created a Power CLI script that would go in and you could do it based on tags, you can do it based on the name of the VM, however you want to organize that based on what folder the VM is in, any kind of different basis for how you want to determine that. And I just reduced the memory of the VM by half. So I just went in there, took the memory of the VM, divided it by half, and then changed the configuration of the VM. And I set that so that would happen before those VMs turned on. So while the VM is off, getting ready to be started, change the memory, and now I've got more capacity at my recovery site. And then the one thing to keep in mind, the corollary to that is you want to make sure that you have it configured so that when you fail back, you don't have the memory of that VM again, that you double the memory of it when you fail it the other way. So just one example of one of the things that you can do with scripts with SRM. So everything that we've covered, any questions on that or anything else related to SRM? Yes? So if I understand that correctly, the question was, you're wondering about when you do a IP subnet map, can you map it back in the other direction?
I want to preserve the VM's IP address scheme from the protection site.
So when you say, so you want to preserve the VM's IP scheme, so there's nothing that, the only thing that's changing when you do an IP subnet map is you're just changing the network portion of the address. The host portion is going to stay the same.
I want the network portion to stay the same.
So you don't want to change the IP address when you move the VM?
I just want to move it over because there's an issue at the protection site. We had some catastrophic failure.
Yeah, so if you want to move a VM without changing its address, that's fully supported. Yeah. And one thing to to just mention about changing IP addresses is if you can, SRM fully supports changing IP addresses, but if you can avoid changing IP addresses, I'd recommend it just because changing IP addresses will add fairly significantly to your recovery time. Because what SRM is going to do is it's going to, as part of the recovery, it's going to turn on the VM with the NIC disconnected, change that IP address, then turn it off, and then turn it on again in the order that you've defined. So you're basically having to reboot, to boot every VM twice in order to get that IP address changed. Again, it's fully supported, something it's totally capable of doing, but if you're looking to reduce your RTO, how long it takes you to recover, avoid that if you can. Yeah, question?
We'll have to repeat the questions. The mics aren't on.
So the question was, do we support just a single IP address when we do an IP customization, or will we support multiple IP addresses? So I'm pretty sure that if you have multiple NICs and those are mapped, that it'll change. Right. So in that situation, if you have one NIC with multiple IP addresses, that's not something that SRM IP customization is going to be able to do. That is something that you can do, again, through a script. So in addition to running a script on the SRM server, like the one that I was talking about where we're going to change the resources for VMs, you can also run a script on a VM at that point, you're only going to be able to run the script after power up. So after power up, you can run a script that will just change whatever IP addresses you need. So, any other questions? Yeah. So the question was, are you able to throttle vSphere replication?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. So with vSphere Replication 6.0, we introduced the capability to actually segregate, if you will, the traffic with vSphere replication. For example, I can dedicate a VM kernel port in vSphere to just replication traffic. If I'm using distributed switches, then I can turn around and turn on network I/O control, and then I can throttle it that way. So it is possible to do that, but it's not built into vSphere replication itself. It's something you're going to have those distributed switches for, and you're going to have to configure, like I say, multiple NICs on your target vSphere replication appliance, and also at your source as well, to make sure that traffic is on one line and everything else, like management traffic, for example, is elsewhere, so you can throttle just that replication traffic. So yes, it can be done, but it's not a checkbox thing. Okay?
How complicated is it to switch from SAN replication to vSphere replication?
How complicated is it to switch from SAN replication to vSphere replication? Are you talking about if you already have SAN replication, you have SRM configured with protection groups and all that? What you're going to have to do is establish, I would stop replication at the SAN level first. It's probably not a good idea to replicate both vSphere replication and SAN, array-based in other words, at the same time. So you want to stop that, establish vSphere replication, but then you're going to have to go back in and you're going to have to start over with your protection groups and your recovery plans for the most part. So you won't have to redo all your mappings and everything, so all that's going to be good. But as far as the actual protection group and recovery plan, you're going to have to do some work there again. So not a huge effort, but it's not automatic.
And that could be a good use case for something like VCO, because if you wanted to script that beforehand, that way all of that work that you would have to do is basically done for you, and you're not, it's automated, so you don't have to go through and do it all manually. So
I'll throw out, too, that it's not one or the other. A lot of customers have that perception that, I'm using array-based replication, therefore I can't use vSphere replication. The answer is you can use both with SRM. It supports using both in the same environment. Again, you'll want to avoid, though, replicating the same VM with both replication technologies, and then you start getting protection groups that are one's mapped to SAN, one's mapped to vSphere replication, and it gets a little crazy. So, like, for example, you may want to do a two-tier type of offering. Maybe your tier 1 apps need that really, really low RPO, like 1 minute or synchronous replication or whatever. So you could use that at the array level and cut down on the number of VMs and stuff you're having to pay for there. Maybe tier 2 is vSphere replication with that 15-minute or even 5-minute RPO if you're using vSAN. So you can use both. Nothing wrong with that.
you can even, just to be clear, you can even have both types of replication, both types of protection groups in the same recovery plan as well. So, yeah. Yeah. So the question was, it looks like SRM is fully utilizing the web client and no longer using the thick client. And that's correct. That changed in SRM 5.8. So 5.8 and later is fully utilizing the web client. 5.5 and earlier is the thick client.
Web client's way better than the old client anyway, right? Come on.
Yeah. Okay, so minimum versions for SRM 6.1. So it's going to require vCenter 6.0, I think it's update A or update 1. It's vCenter 6.0, but the latest version of vCenter 6.0 is required for SRM 6.1.
It's B, right?
So supporting. So the question was, does SRM support having VMs that are in a data store cluster? And the answer is yes. So you can have a VM that's in a data store cluster, and as of SRM 6, we actually support heterogeneous clusters. So previously, we only supported VMs that were in a data store cluster where all of the ones in that VM were replicated and in the same consistency group. So as of 6.0, though, you can actually have a mix of data stores in there. So you could have data stores that are replicated, data stores that aren't, even data stores that are in different consistency groups within SRM. And SRM will work with storage DRS to make sure that those VMs stay on the ones that they're supposed to stay on. So, and even if you're using vSphere replication, yes.
At that point, it doesn't matter what data store it's on.
Yeah.
The vSphere replication doesn't care for the most part, right? It's going to just grab the I/O out of the path, and it's going to be able to replicate that across, regardless of the underlying storage. It could be a data store cluster, it could be vSAN, it could be local storage. Doesn't matter. It works.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Where's product management?
Yeah.
In the house? We'll take that back.
Yeah.
Good suggestion.
Yeah, go ahead. So the WAN requirements for vSphere replication? So the question was, what are the WAN requirements or latency requirements for SRM? So one key point is SRM is not a replication solution. So SRM utilizes either vSphere replication or array-based replication. So as far as the bandwidth that you would need for your array-based replication, that's something you'd have to ask the array vendor. For vSphere replication, though, there is a vSphere replication calculator that will help you determine how much bandwidth you're going to need. It'll let you plug in how many VMs you're protecting, how big they are, what the change rate is, a whole bunch of things like that, and it'll give you back a number of how much bandwidth you're going to need in order to be able to replicate those. It depends. So, I mean, if you think about it, if you have, vSphere replication will replicate up to 2,000 VMs. If you have 2,000 VMs and you set, a 4-hour RPO for all of them and they have a really high data change rate, I mean, you could be talking about needing gigabytes of bandwidth. Everything down to if you've got 5 VMs that have a low data change rate, you might be able to get by with a 1.5 meg link. So it really just depends. This is the calculator, and it's got a little bit of an ugly URL up there, but it actually is vmware.com/VR calculator. So VR calculator will get you there and let you plug in all of that information. It'll give you a nice report and everything. Yes? So could vCloud Air function on an internal network? Well,
were you at the keynote this morning? Did you hear that SRM Air thing? Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. So that's for vCloud Air. Very similar functionality to SRM. So we orchestrate the failover, but we use a product called SRM Air instead of SRM for that. Is that what you're asking about?
Yeah, something like that was a lot simpler, but you could also then just be motion on your site. It just seemed like that product was a little easier, but I think it's trying to be sold as a service. I'm seeing it as something different, not an internal network.
Yeah, vCloud Air is definitely just sold as a service, though. So it's not something that you're going to be able to install in your internally. You could build something internally if you chose to, but.
So wait, if I'm hearing this right, are you thinking maybe it'd be good to have like a subscription I could pay for, and instead of having to install all these components, it could manage my internal clouds as well? No? Oh, with SRM Air. Oh, okay, yeah, you're right. SRM Air is strictly a subscription-based product from vCloud Air. Yep. Now, there's other providers out there, by the way. I'll finish the answer to that question. We'll move to the next one. But there are some service providers that offer a recovery site as a service for SRM. I don't have specific examples off the top of my head, but I'm sure you can go to our partner network on VMware.com and find some of those out there. So that is possible to do that. If you don't want to have that second site, having to build that out, configure it, pay for it, all that stuff, that's another option for SRM. Yep. Gotcha.
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yes. So is the script, the thing that I was talking about with scripting, is that going to be available in the UI? So yeah, well, that's not something that is going, I don't think there's any plans at this point to add that kind of functionality to the UI. It really is just going to be available. The thing that's built into SRM is the ability to run any kind of a script. So if you can run that script, if you can run a script on your SRM server to do the thing that you want, SRM is capable of running that. So now the question was, does that extend to VCO workflows? SRM doesn't currently have the ability to trigger an outbound VCO workflow unless if you could get a VCO workflow to run, kick off a VCO workflow from your SRM server, like from a command line on your SRM server. If you are able to trigger a VCO workflow, then you could do that. I don't really know an easy way to do that, though. Good question, though.
Got about 2 minutes left.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Can you initiate a failover or a failback from VCO? Yeah. Yeah. You can do that through Power CLI, actually. So, yeah. Sorry, question again? Right. Yeah, so when you fail over from one site to another, the first thing that it's going to do is going to power down the VM that's at the protected site, remove the storage, add it at the recovery site, and power it back on. Yeah. The reprotect is just reversing the flow of replication, and then when you fail back, it's that same process again. So the VM, you're moving the VM from the protected site to the recovery site, so nothing is going to stay at the recovery site, or the original protected site.
It does stay online. There's no downtime during a reprotect workflow.
Right.
The replication happens as the virtual machine is powered on, so there's no downtime to the source VM when you're doing the reprotect. Yeah. No worries.
Yeah. So the question was kind of more detail around how would you script changing multiple IP addresses. So if we're talking about a Windows box, you can script with Power CLI. You can write a Power CLI script that will change IP addresses on a VM. So with SRM, you have the ability to trigger a Power CLI script on a VM as part of your recovery plan. So for each VM, as an example, you could say, when you start up, run this script, and that script would be the thing that would change their IP addresses when they boot up. Does that answer it?
Yeah, GS, we're out of time, dude.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll keep taking more. We've got to end, but we'll keep taking more questions just as we walk out. So, thanks.